Hi everyone, welcome to this GMAT Club presentation of Guess Where They Got In. My name is Doris Huang and I'm a senior consultant at Admissionado. We are a premier admissions consulting firm that works with clients from all over the world on applications to highly competitive MBA programs, and we're really excited to be partnering with GMAT Club on this series. A lot of you already know who we are, but for those of you who don't, I'll say a few words about us at the end of this video. But for now, I know the reason you're here is to hear about this case study, so let's dive right in. One of the things that we love about this Guess Where They Got In series is the chance to show you all how misleading it can be to draw too strong of a conclusion about an applicant's outcome when we have the benefit of hindsight. In fact, that's why we chose this particular case study, which is based on a real client of ours, because there just happened to be some A/B tests embedded in his story that helped us isolate what really made a difference to his admissions chances and what did not. Let's call this client Sandeep. We've modified some details to protect his confidentiality, but this is a real-life example. Let's start by looking at what we learned about Sandeep when we first met him. At the time, he was a 32-year-old Indian male. He had scored a 630 on the GMAT and had a 3.7 GPA in electrical and computer engineering from the University of Portland. Just as an aside, he had taken the GMAT multiple times a couple years ago and believed that 630 was the highest score he could get, so there was no sense in taking the exam again. Like many engineers born outside the US, he actually did pretty well in the quant section, but struggled with the verbal section, leading to a lower overall score. Going back to his profile, Sandeep had also taken and passed 2 of the 3 levels of the CFA, or Chartered Financial Analyst exam, which is a prestigious credential for financial and investment professionals that requires rigorous study. In terms of his work experience, he had worked for 3 years in real estate investment banking right after college, followed by 5 years as a private equity analyst and associate at Apollo Global Management. However, here's the big twist. 18 months ago, Sandeep's upward moving career was suddenly cut short when his mom and dad were involved in a terrible car accident. At the time, his wife was in a particularly demanding phase of her medical training as a surgeon, and there was no one else to care for his parents during the recovery or for his twin daughters who were only toddlers. So, Sandeep made the decision to take a leave of absence from his career in order to be a full-time caregiver. As tough as it was to walk away from a brilliant private equity career, he knew that he had to put his family first. He tried to keep one foot in his previous world by investing a small amount of his own savings through an online brokerage account, but most of his days were consumed with taking care of his family. It turns out his parents' recovery took longer than they expected, so Sandeep's plans to return to work relatively soon didn't pan out. By this time, he had realized that his true interest lay in real estate, where he began his career. So, once his mom and dad were back on their feet, he refocused his sights on applying to business school, with the goal of transitioning back into real estate after graduation and eventually running a real estate-focused investment fund in the long term. Speaking of business school, let's hit pause here for a minute. In studying Sandeep's case, in addition to looking at all the biographical factors that I've just mentioned, it's also critical that you understand his MBA application history. As it turns out, Sandeep applied to business school not once, not twice, but 3 times. The first time he applied, he was 28 years old and still an associate at Apollo, at the peak of his pre-MBA career trajectory. This should have been his best shot at admission, but he was actually dinged from both NYU and Cornell with no interviews. He was very surprised, because he'd put together what in his mind had been a rock-solid case for why he wanted an MBA. In his essays, he wrote that he wanted to draw on his private equity experience and raise a fund of his own that would be his to manage, so he needed the MBA for the network to be able to do that. While his reasoning was logical, the problem was that from the AdCom's perspective, this wasn't a compelling enough argument to admit him, especially when coupled with his stats, which I'll get to in a minute. At that time, Sandeep already had several years of hands-on PE experience, so he clearly didn't need MBA coursework to help him in that area. Moreover, Apollo is a big-time name in the private equity world, and Sandeep had already built strong relationships with other investors during his time working there, so the AdCom wasn't convinced that he needed an MBA to be able to raise a small fund of his own, since he was already well-connected. The second time he applied, he was 30 years old and had recently left Apollo to care for his family. As a reapplicant with very little by way of new news, and now with an unexplained gap in his resume, albeit a short one at the time, It wasn't altogether surprising that he got dinged again from the same schools. The third time Sandeep applied, this time with admissionado on board, he was now 32 years old, well above the average age for full-time MBA programs, and he'd been out of the workforce for 18 whole months with no new professional stories to tell. Yet somehow, in this third attempt, when his chances seemed to be totally unraveling, he actually succeeded in gaining admission not only to NYU and Cornell, the same two schools that rejected him twice, but also to Cambridge. Wild, right? So how does this make any sense? The first thing we did with Sandeep was a postmortem of his two failed application attempts. We wanted to really understand how he had framed his story and his goals so that we could help him retool his game plan and come up with a winning strategy. There are a few obvious concerns about his profile that probably caught your attention already. His age wasn't originally a concern in his first attempt, but it became more of an issue as time went on. Second, his 630 GMAT score was also low for his Indian male demographic, which tends to be very competitive and which also tends to skew higher. Moreover, while his undergrad GPA of 3.7 was strong, the University of Portland isn't a top-ranked school. The prestige of an undergrad institution counts for more with some MBA programs than others, but it most likely played a role here, especially given his lower GMAT score. Coupled with his lack of a clear, persuasive narrative about why he really needed an MBA, these factors unfortunately hobbled his first application attempt. Of course, the elephant in the room that popped up in his second attempt was the ongoing gap in his resume. Whenever an applicant is currently unemployed, it does raise questions for the AdCom or admissions committee, such as whether the employee was terminated, which isn't a death sentence, but which does have to be explained rather than swept under the carpet. At the time, Sandeep had just quit his job at Apollo to care for his family, so he decided not to say anything about his family situation. In hindsight, this was probably not the right move, as the lack of any explanation, along with no new developments in his career, left too much doubt in the AdCom's mind. During the same second round of applications, Sandeep chose to emphasize the fact that even though he was no longer working, he still made time to invest his personal savings in an online brokerage account as a way of staying engaged with the markets. At first, he was really eager to reemphasize this investing hobby again in his third round of applications too, thinking that it showed that he still had his finger on the pulse of the markets. However, the problem with this approach is that his personal investing hobby was never going to be able to measure up to the experience that other applicants had while they were still working at major firms, often managing enormous sums of money. Moreover, this approach distracted from the explanation that the AdCom really needed to hear, which is why he had been out of the workforce for this long. Here's where we got to work with our approach of looking beyond the stats and getting to really know our client inside and out. Once we joined forces with Sandeep and dissected the reasons for his previous dings, it didn't take us long to discover some truly impressive building blocks in his profile that could be repackaged in a new way to put his very best foot forward. The truth is, Sandeep had clearly been on the up and up in his career prior to his parents' accident. Once he had homed in on his long-term career goal of running a real estate investment fund, it became really obvious that he had the perfect background for this, between his real estate investment banking training and his private equity experience. No one could have guessed that tragedy would strike his family the way it did, when it did. Instead of moaning about his fate, he faced the music and stepped up to bat in his role as a son, as a husband, and as a father. Does this sound like a quitter to you? No way. We just had to shed light on all of this great stuff for the AdCom to clearly see what had been invisible in Sandeep's first two application attempts. So we took a no apologies approach to his career gap and tackled it head on. The truth is that what AdComs ultimately try to predict is future career potential based on previous career success. Sandeep had previous career success in spades. Between investment banking and private equity, he had experience working on both the sell side and the buy side of major deals. Plus, he already had solid knowledge of the real estate industry from his banking job, which made his post-MBA goal of working in real estate investment both believable and achievable. Once we shifted our focus to his track record prior to his career gap, and once he explained his personal reasons for choosing to leave Apollo, the AdCom had no problem whatsoever with this resume gap. Sandeep had clearly made the best decision for his family, doing the right thing for his parents, his wife, and his daughters, despite all the societal and financial pressure to continue this high-flying career. There's no shame in that, and it was important for Sandeep to own it. We also worked with Sandeep to identify specific real estate industry employers that had a history of recruiting at the schools he was applying to, and that would be perfect career stepping stones for him immediately after business school. Often applicants know what their long-term career goals are, but they have trouble articulating the more short-term or medium-term goals that will get them there. So showing the AdCom that you've researched specific companies that have a recruiting relationship with their school and that will be a natural post-MBA transition for you is a really smart way to boost your credibility. To shore up Sandeep's academic chops, despite his low GMAT score, we chose to highlight the 2 levels of the CFA exam that he had already passed, along with his high undergrad engineering GPA, in order to demonstrate his ability to handle rigorous academic work, especially in quantitative subjects, which generally dominate MBA curricula. He hadn't previously included the CFA results in his resume because he hadn't taken or passed the 3rd and final level yet. But in our view, the results were highly relevant to his academic credentials, and passing levels 1 and 2 is an accomplishment in and of itself that many finance professionals don't have. Finally, after discussing with Sandeep how we could increase his chances of acceptance at a highly ranked school that he'd be excited to attend, we added Oxford, Said, and Cambridge Judge to his target school list, along with NYU and Cornell. These schools generally have lower GMAT score ranges than other similarly ranked programs in the US, but they're still very prestigious institutions with strong global reputations and employer recruiting relationships. While working with his admissionado consultant, Sandeep revealed that while his wife was drawn to New York City for professional reasons, she actually had some interesting fellowship opportunities in the London area, as well as nearby family members who would be open to childcare responsibilities for their daughters. Combined with Sandeep's own itch for an experience abroad and their proximity to London, Oxford and Cambridge naturally made a lot of sense for him. So as you already know, the results of Sandeep's 3rd application attempt spoke for themselves. He was admitted to both NYU and Cornell this time, as well as Cambridge Judge. He ultimately chose to attend NYU because of its prestigious name in real estate circles, and because of his wife's career prospects in New York. So what are the key takeaways from Sandeep's story? First, honesty is the best policy. There's no point in hiding from the truth, because AdComs will pick up on it, or they'll infer something worse than the truth. They read thousands of applications a year for a living, so they've seen it all. It's best to be honest upfront about what has happened in your life and your career, so long as you have an explanation that's logical and that demonstrates your decision-making process. Second, everyone has a dream school, but don't be shy about pushing the envelope when you're coming up with your target school list, like we did with Sandeep by adding Oxford and Cambridge. Think outside the box about what you really care about and what you're really seeking in a business school experience. Forums like GMAT Club and consultants like Admissionado can be great resources in helping match your interests and goals to schools that might not have been obvious choices to begin with, but that might actually turn out to be a strong fit for you. Remember that MBA admissions isn't a formula. Decisions aren't made by a computer algorithm in a vacuum, but by a group of human beings with complex goals. Be careful about looking at cherry-picked outcomes and concluding with too much confidence that a particular outcome was predetermined by specific profile elements. What matters more is how those elements were stitched together in a certain way and how they happened to land with a particular AdCom on a particular day and in a particular year. For every case that makes perfect sense given the profile elements, there are 5 times as many that'll leave you scratching your head. In fact, based on Sandeep's stats alone, like his GMAT, age, and work gap, if you would guess that he had been rejected again in his 3rd round of applications, that wouldn't have been a bad guess. In many cases, stats like that tend to be correlated with an overall narrative that doesn't suggest outsized future success. But in Sandeep's case, it turns out that these stats or profile elements were actually obscuring the true story of his career potential, as well as his character. What we did was break through the surface level of those stats to unearth his real narrative and make it shine for the AdCom. That's why we always recommend de-emphasizing what the profile elements look like in isolation, instead focusing on how to make them all hum together, and then applying to a really smart set of schools that takes into account the appropriate amount of risk for you. If you've maxed out your personal potential with your specific pitch, the outcomes are more likely to meet and often surpass your expectations. Finally, notice here that the facts of Sandeep's career trajectory and work experience didn't change. What changed was the information that he presented in his applications and how he presented it. That's what ultimately made the difference between his first 2 failed applications and his 3rd successful one. Sandeep ultimately got into NYU, Cornell, and Cambridge, not because of his profile, but in spite of it. The real secret in his case was the connective tissue that, when summed up tautly, overwhelmed what should have been a pretty problematic GMAT score, age, and work gap. Not everyone has a perfect story to weave into that precise outcome, but the key lesson that we want you to walk away with is the power of a clear pitch, nailing the heart of what makes you special and making that pitch sing. What we like about this case is the fact that we don't need to rely on hindsight. We actually have 2 additional case studies buried within this larger case study of how the same person who had previously applied at a stronger point in his career and at a more attractive age was actually less successful than he was 2 attempts later, when every element in his application had grown exponentially worse. The only real difference was hitting the AdCom with a more thoughtful, sincere pitch that cut to the core of what made his case the most potent. And it worked. That wraps up our case study. Thanks so much for tuning in. I hope this video gave you a good taste for the unique way that we approach applications at Admissionato. Like many of our colleagues here, all of us hold MBA degrees from top-tier programs. But one of the ways that we're different is that our consultants do admissions consulting part-time. We all have day jobs as entrepreneurs, investment professionals, tech product managers, really any post-MBA field that you can think of. We do this work because we're passionate about using what we've learned ourselves to help other professionals make their MBA dreams come true, not because we want to collect a paycheck. What's more, our outsider's perspective allows us to bring sharp, fresh eyes to every applicant's story. And most of us only take on a few clients per round, which means you get our laser focus rather than getting lost in the shuffle. Another thing that we do differently is that we also bring professional writers onto your Admissionato team. When you work with us, not only do you benefit from a top MBA's strategic positioning to frame your story in the best possible light, but you also get top-notch editors who dig into your essays line by line to make them shine. It's a 1-2 punch that allows each of us to specialize in what we do best and deliver the best results to you. Please check out our upcoming 2nd GMAT Club video in June for more juicy insights. And if you're curious to learn more about us, you can visit our website at www.admissionato.com for details about how to contact us for a free consultation, or look for us on Twitter under the handle @Admissionato. We hope to see you soon.